In today's video tutorial, I'd like to speak with you about understanding plagiarism. I'll provide you with the different types of plagiarisms, examples of those, as well as how to avoid plagiarism. We all kind of have a familiar understanding of what plagiarism is. But essentially, it's when somebody takes someone's ideas or work and claims it as their own without acknowledgement of the original source. Generally speaking, we have an idea of what plagiarism means, but there's a lot of nuances to it, and I'd like to explain that a little bit further. The first type of direct plagiarism is probably what we're most familiar with, or we think what plagiarism means. It's when somebody would take a word-for-word copying to place it in their own paper or own work without attribution of the authors from the original source. They may not use quotation marks to indicate that it's a direct quote, and sometimes it's partial or parts of an original document and not the entire document itself, as long as there's more than 5 consecutive words that are not adequately cited or indicated that it's coming from a different source. This would be an example of direct plagiarism. Buying papers online or sharing papers through social media or just through friends is another example of direct plagiarism. I'll give you a minute to look at the middle section here and read the original source and what a student submitted in their own paper. So is this an example of plagiarism? And indeed it is. Even though you can see that a few words have been omitted, the majority of the words are still the same. And in this case, the author does not attribute credit, nor use quotation marks or an in-text citation to indicate that it is not their own words or idea. So this is an example of direct plagiarism. And this can happen often in these little segments, in these little sections. So it's important to remember that it doesn't have to be the entire paper to be considered plagiarism. There can be small portions of an original paper. So it's really important to make an effort to paraphrase and summarize effectively and cite your sources. Some of the ways that you can avoid direct plagiarism is to take notes while you're reading. Most people, I know students or understand what they tend to do is to read a journal article and write a paper at the same time. This lends itself to unintentionally sometimes fall into the category of direct plagiarism. They might copy and paste. They might not be able to reformat or rethink what the original source says. So an important step you can take is to read the journal article without writing at the same time and take notes as you're reading, and then use the notes to help you write a paper. It's important to practice paraphrasing and summarizing. And in general, in APA format, you'll want to avoid direct quotes. Either eliminate them entirely or use them in a very limited way. Of course, do not copy and paste. You'll want to cite your sources properly in APA format. And students can use plagiarism detectors as well. So you can get a report on how similar your paper is to the original source. Most of these plagiarism detectors are available in your learning management system, like D2L or Blackboard. And if it's not available, you might be able to ask your instructor to open that up so that you can see a report yourself and make adjustments. Another type of plagiarism is paraphrasing plagiarism. As I mentioned, generally speaking, you want to limit the number of direct quotes in APA format. However, it can be a real challenge to learn how to paraphrase and summarize sufficiently. So in some cases, if the original text is too similar, whether that's by syntax, mechanics, or just the feel of the word or the order, or even the rhythm of the wording, can cause this look to look very similar to the original source. And because it's not sufficiently paraphrased, meaning it's not summarized or paraphrased well enough, it can be considered plagiarism. Especially if, in that case, you don't also provide a citation, even when the source is being paraphrased. Even during paraphrasing and summarizing, you'll need to include an in-text citation of the original source. An example of paraphrasing plagiarism is here. I'll give you a second to read the original source and what a student submitted. So is this an example of plagiarism? Indeed it is. A lot of people get caught into the trap of just changing a few words here and there, or changing it slightly enough, and they don't fully summarize or paraphrase the original source. So the reason for that this is considered plagiarism is that there's only a few words that have been changed. It does not attribute credit using an in-text citation, and in general, it's not paraphrased sufficiently. Ways to avoid paraphrasing plagiarism is to avoid writing, again, while reading original sources. Take notes and then write your paper. Avoid the thesaurus trap. If you're looking at an original source and you're just changing a few words by looking up synonyms in the thesaurus, that's not going to be sufficient. Again, you'll need to practice paraphrasing and summarizing. It's a challenge, and it takes practice. You'll need to cite your sources properly in APA format, and again, use those plagiarism detectors. They can help you identify when you may not have summarized or paraphrased sufficiently. Another type of plagiarism is called source-based plagiarism. And in this, there are three different main types. The first one is when somebody falsifies a citation. So for example, they provide a citation and an associated reference in their paper that's not real. Perhaps it's not a real source. Perhaps it's not in existence. You can also have misleading citations. This is when you include a citation and you try to cite a source, or you try to mislead in some way. So for example, in your paper you include a citation to a source, but you never read that source. But you include it in your paper and you also include a reference to that source. That's misleading. It's suggesting to the reader that you've actually looked and used that source in your paper. Another example of a misleading citation is on the left here, on the bottom is the original journal article, and on the right here is the abstract on the internet. That is not a full text document, but it includes the abstract. So a misleading citation could be that you actually just read the abstract online and cited that source, even though you cited the journal article. So that could be misleading and suggesting that you read the whole article when really all you did was read the abstract. Another example is citing an incorrect source. So, for example, if you're reading a book about Sigmund Freud, but the book was not written by Freud, it was written by someone else, and you cited the Freud as though Freud wrote that book. And indeed he didn't, because the book was written in 2020. So it's not a correct source. So even misciting a source is indicating that you used a source that wasn't in front of you. Generally speaking, you can only cite the sources that you have in hand. So if you're reading about in an article, which they often do, about other sources, you can only cite the source that you have in front of you. Ways that you can avoid source-based plagiarism is, again, cite only the sources that you have in hand, that you have in front of you, that you physically read yourself. You can find, if you're reading an article and it's citing another article, one way to deal with that issue is to go and find the source that's being cited in the journal article that you're reading. Go find the original source, and then you can use that in your paper as well. One way you can deal with this too is use a working bibliography. Now, what do I mean by that? As you're working, you should be creating your own reference list. That way, you don't get confused about what you've used and what you haven't used. And it's really important to understand that there are different types of sources. A PDF from a database is referenced differently than a PDF that you find online. So you'll have to understand how those are referenced in your reference list, and also how you cite them in your original paper, in your paper. The last one is self-plagiarism. A lot of students will often ask me, well, why is this an issue? And generally speaking, when you submit a paper, it's a published document. So you'll have to remember or think about it that way. So self-plagiarism is whenever you've submitted previous work, either partial, it could be a paragraph or two, or the complete paper, without permission from both professors. You submit that previous work from fall 2020, and now you submit it in the same paper or part of that paper in spring 2021 to a different professor. That's an example of self-plagiarism. So in order to avoid that, it's important to just every time write up a new paper each time you have an assignment. You might reference or look back at old papers to help you with references or an argument or way that you argued a paper. That's fine, but each paper should be unique and original for each assignment. So that's just some examples, four main examples of plagiarism. There are other nuances to it that I won't go into detail with, but generally speaking, those are the four major ones that instructors look for when they're reading a paper. And instructors have these tools to detect plagiarism. And generally, when we look for, if we have a concern that there's been plagiarism, whether it's intentional or accidental, we'll start to do some research to find out if it's really plagiarism or if it's that somebody needs to learn how to paraphrase and summarize even better. So we can use plagiarism checkers to help us with that. That will compare your original document, your submitted paper, to this database of a ton of journal articles, any journal article really, other students' papers across institutions. So somebody could have written a paper in Utah and it might pick up that you use similar language, and even the internet. So it looks at different places where we can determine whether or not the paper that's been submitted had some examples of plagiarism. We can also do easy Google searches. I've unfortunately found a lot of students submit papers when they've plagiarized, and it takes me 2 minutes to look on Google to find that particular paper. And then there's a conversation about how to deal with that. And sometimes it requires me to refer them to academic integrity. Whether or not the plagiarism is intentional, or if it was accidental, or that you were trying but you didn't know how to do it, that doesn't matter. The violation of academic integrity doesn't look at what the intention was of the person writing the paper. So any examples of plagiarism is considered a violation of academic integrity, regardless of if it was an accident or if it was intentional. It might include further investigation through the Office of Academic Integrity. And some of the consequences to plagiarism is quite range depending on both the instructor, the level of plagiarism that was involved, or even the Office of Academic Integrity. So those consequences can range from, there can be a rewrite, often with some sort of point penalty, that a student can fail a particular assignment where there was examples of plagiarism. You might fail the course. In some situations, there's removal from the institution entirely due to academic dishonesty. And in some cases, it goes on student record. So it's really important to understand how important this is, that you'll learn how to write, to paraphrase, to summarize, to cite your sources, so that you can avoid plagiarism altogether. Generally, how do you improve your writing? Well, understand the different types. We've talked a little bit about that today. As you're writing papers, making sure that you are identifying if there's any examples in your writing of plagiarism. One of the important things about writing in general is to make sure to keep it organized so that you can help yourself to not plagiarize, is to create outlines for your papers. Really complete a step-by-step organization for your paper and take notes. Rather than reading at the same time as you're writing, use your notes that you've taken from your reading of journal articles or books in order to help you write things in your own words, even when you're paraphrasing. Again, practice summarizing, paraphrasing. There'll be another tutorial on that specifically on how to help you learn how to do that. Understand the elements of APA citation style, or if you're using different citation styles, the MLA, Chicago, the medical one, for example, use those publication manuals. They're there to help you. They change every few years or so, it seems like, so you really need to keep up to date. And then, of course, properly cite your sources when integrating any idea or quote from another source. That's really important to do. So I thank you today. I hope that helps to explain a little bit more about plagiarism and the different types and how to avoid it. And we'll look forward to the next time we meet.